Welcome to Praxis, a podcast where we explore how to practice and embody the way of Jesus in our everyday lives. Thanks so much for taking the time to listen. Today we're talking about another one of our core values as a church, which is team leadership. We believe that leadership in the church is really important, which is why it's so painful when it goes sideways. So in this episode, we break down some of the primary variables contributing to church leadership fails, and then we offer a team leadership model as a healthy alternative, where authority is diffused among a team of mature Jesus followers who are submitting to one another and the leadership of the Holy Spirit. And we'll share what that looks like for us. So that's where we're headed. Here's another episode of Praxis on team leadership.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Cameron.
And I'm Mac.
And I'm Katie.
How was your Valentine's Day? Like that?
Oh, that's so good.
Cameron tried really hard to think of a question other than how's it going to start us off here today. Too generic.
Okay.
My Valentine's Day was fine.
That's good.
Completely ununique. It was just a normal day. Well, I'll take that back. I did get roses from my husband, Alex, and
Nice.
I got a Valentine's book from Charlie.
Oh, that's cool.
Every page was a different expression of love.
I did not get roses from Megan.
You didn't?
No.
I'll have to talk to her.
She gave me chocolate, though, so that was good.
Well, that's nice.
This year, so Josie and I had our first official date on Valentine's Day, and this year marked 21 years ago that happened. And we do have a little tradition, so I don't think we don't make a big deal of Valentine's Day. But on our first date, we did coffee ice cream with Heath bar on top. And so we still do that every year. That was nice.
And Josie told me that she was up half the night because of it.
Yeah, she doesn't drink coffee, and the coffee ice cream, I guess.
Had real
I was
coffee.
I was out cold, no
knew?
problem.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It's funny.
Cool. Well, we are in a series right now where we're talking about our core values as a church. And so one of the things we're doing is naming what those values are and talking about ways we try to live into them and ways we're inviting you who are part of our church community to live into them as well. So in our last episode, we talked about generosity. If you haven't listened, I encourage you to go take a listen. Today, we're going to talk about team leadership. And here at Crosspoint, we embrace a team model of leadership where authority is diffused among a team of mature Jesus followers who are submitting to one another and to the leadership of the Holy Spirit.
So one thing I learned when preparing for this episode is that a lot of people have a lot of thoughts about leadership. Like you do a Google search and there's quotes all over the board, books upon quotes upon blog posts, and everyone kind of has something different to say. Some say a leader is someone who has vision. Some say it's all about character. Some say a leader has to be like really front and center. Some say they should be in the background and you don't even really know that they're there. But all around, people tend to agree that leadership is pretty important. Some might even say everything rises and falls on leadership. It's another quote for you. So I'm not sure if that's entirely true or not, but it certainly highlights the importance of leadership. And we agree here that leadership is ridiculously important and that a whole lot hangs on it. So why do you guys think leadership matters?
Oh, I think on a basic level, leadership is someone's saying, hey, let's do this. And it's really like on a really practical level, it's necessary if anything is going to happen. I think about we're in Easter Jam planning time right now, which is like our kids' Easter service. And so me and Sarah, our kids director, after Christmas and it's kind of the lull, like eventually one of us has to say like, hey, let's talk about Easter Jam. And that's like taking some leadership to initiate like, hey, here's a thing that we should at least consider doing this year.
Yeah, like a leadership-less church is often a directionless church. As Cameron's naming, like if you've ever been part of a meeting where it wasn't clear who is actually leading it, we know that how disorganized and chaotic it can get. So I think churches without leadership tend to stagnate. They don't experience a whole lot of kingdom breakthrough. I think they tend to remain immature. There's not a whole lot of discipling towards Christ-likeness, and there's a lot of chaos where everybody's sort of doing, what's right in their own eyes. So I think I would just second what you're saying, Cameron, which is like, yeah, someone needs to, or a group of people need to kind of go, okay, where are we going, and discern God's leading and what it looks like to faithfully respond and, provide guidance through change and transitions and keep the mission, vision, and values front and center. One other thing I would name is that I think this is, everybody has some responsibility for this, but I think leaders bear a higher degree of responsibility is creating and sustaining culture. And I think they often do that by through living by example. And so they have to model what it is to follow Jesus and equip people to join them. They have to live out what they're inviting people to live into. It's kind of as Paul says in 1 Corinthians, he's like, hey, follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. And Katie, you introduced some language to me over the past couple of years, which is like tone at the top. Mm-hmm. Leaders set the tone at the top. And I don't think the way I hear you using that phrase isn't to like reinforce hierarchy, but rather to promote accountability. Mm-hmm. Like if we are going to say this is what we value as a church and as church leadership, then we have the primary responsibility of living into that ourselves so that everybody around us can see what it is that we value by the way we actually relate. Mm-hmm. And when there's congruence there, here's what we value and here's what we're living, and we can see those who have positions or the responsibility of leadership doing so, it really creates a lot of breakthrough and trust and momentum. But man, when there's a gap between here's what our values are and the leaders aren't even living into those things, it really kind of breaks down quickly. Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like when you say to your kids, there's no yelling in this house.
Yeah, that's exactly what I had in mind.
Hopefully I didn't cause a car accident. Anyway.
Thanks for that, Cameron. Yeah, it'd be like that. Like, hey, you're yelling at your kids and telling them the content of what you're saying is that there's no yelling. Mm-hmm. That would be.
Yeah, you can't create a culture without embodying what that culture is. If you're a leader, you have some increased responsibility. And I think that brings us maybe to a third point, which is accountability. And I know that word can maybe have a negative connotation for many people, and if I were to guess, it's probably because accountability hasn't always been carried out in healthy ways. Like I think it can be, it can come with shame or judgment. But when it's done well, accountability can be really healthy and even necessary. Brene Brown says accountability is a prerequisite for change. So if you're in a situation that requires change, which let's be honest, every organization, every business, every church is going to have problems, right? Every system, family.
Well, I mean, we know you have problems.
Yeah, I have problems. I'll put myself out there. Anywhere I go, there seem to be problems. So I think the question is not, will you have problems, but how do you deal with them? And leaders model accountability by actually having the courage and the insight to get to the root of a problem and figure out what needs to be done to move forward in the best way. And when you don't have that, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I didn't mean to interrupt. You keep going.
Well, I was just going to say, I think there's ways to deal with that in healthy ways. And I think in unhealthy ways, you kind of have two ditches. One would be overreacting to problems in a way that shames people and makes them less likely to take responsibility or just, feel a lot of shame and walk away, or completely bypassing problems and acting like they don't exist.
Yeah, I think I really like what you're bringing to the table here. And I think there is a lot of baggage around accountability. And perhaps it starts with leaders putting structures and things in place to hold themselves accountable, right? Mm-hmm. I think because what's happened is the baggage is rooted in the fact that people have used power to hold other people accountable to things that they may not even have agreed to be held accountable to in the first place. So it's just this command and control and coercive power where you're acting upon someone else. Mm-hmm. And maybe this is just where I'm at right now, but I think that leaders need to be held accountable first and foremost by being intentional about it. And in fact, the more responsibility they have, the more accountability they need around them. And the lack of accountability around leaders actually makes them incredibly vulnerable. Mm-hmm. And then secondly, I think we need a new way of approaching accountability with others that takes those power dynamics into play, The way I see accountability is more cheering people on to stay true to the commitments that they've made, rather than me imposing commitments on others that I want them to make and then guilting them when they don't follow through. And I think there's a big difference there. Like the way we approach discipleship, for instance, isn't going, hey, here's what Christ-likeness looks like, and you have to live into that, and we shame you when you don't. It's, hey, we want to come alongside you and help discern what it is God's doing, and then you give word. You give word to how you want to take a next step, and we cheer you on toward that. So the accountability, the way we're circling back, is really about helping you stay true to what you said you want to do. Now, in an organization, obviously there are sort of expectations that we have, but those are explicit. Those are recognized by everyone, and accountability is more helping people stay true to what they gave their word to do. What do you guys think about that?
I think that makes sense.
I just feel like, man, there's so much hurt and pain around this accountability piece, and it gets really messy when we're power blind and when we use coercion and force to try to get people to comply to external demands.
And manipulation. I think there could be a lot of manipulation there too. Yeah, I think that makes sense. Leaders ultimately have to be willing to submit themselves to other people, whether that's a board, whether that's a, collaborative leadership model. If you are at the top and you're not willing to submit to anyone outside yourself, well, then of course people are going to be scared to come forward if you're acting in abusive ways.
I preached a sermon, I think it was in 2021, like June of 2021, called The Weight of Leadership. And if you're part of our community, we try to like boil down, give you like a bottom line each week from the text. And it was the with greater leadership comes greater responsibility and greater accountability. So I guess I would just say on this point of accountability, if there's one big takeaway, it's that I think leaders need to put structures and things in place where they're being held accountable, and they need to be mindful then when they're holding others accountable of those power dynamics.
It's impressive. I barely remember what I preached on last week.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's because leadership is so important and so much is impacted by the quality of leadership that it's so incredibly painful when it doesn't go well, when leaders fail. And in other words, when leaders fail and we see the aftermath and all the pain and hurt, it just points to the fact that leadership really matters. And we're seeing leadership fails almost in every sector, politics and so on. But it also feels like in the church world, it's like every month in the headlines, there's another celebrity pastor that has been exposed for some sort of leadership fail. And this isn't entirely new. I mean, in the 80s, you had the two Jimmys, Jimmy Baker and Jimmy Swaggart. And, both of them had these huge platforms and were caught in inappropriate situations, sexual situations. And in the 2000s, you had Ted Haggard, who was literally the face to evangelicalism, the president of the National Association of Evangelicals, got outed for having a multiple-year relationship with a male escort, at the same time lobbying against same-sex relationships in Colorado. I mean, it was just the hypocrisy. And we just continue to see our evangelical celebrities get outed. Bill Hybels, Ravi Zacharias, even Jerry Falwell Jr. at Liberty College, the largest Christian institution. And one of the things I've noticed, and I think this is a positive development, is it used to be the case that, the two main reasons you could get fired or leadership fails would be like an inappropriate sexual relationship and or embezzling money. Like those were the two no-nos. And one of the things I've noticed is that we're actually going, no. There's a lot of other things that really matter. And over the last several years, you've seen many pastors outed also for sort of this domineering, abusive, power-mongering type leadership. James McDonald at Harvest Bible Chapel, and maybe the most famous example would be Mark Driscoll, because Christianity Today did the rise and fall of Mars Hill with Mike Cosper did that, narrating like all these dynamics that were at play the entire time. And so, man, I think there's kind of two things for me in each of these examples. I want to name the aftermath and all the pain and hurt wasn't just at the time that things got exposed. They left a wake of bodies literally their entire tenure. Like there was dysfunction and hurt and pain the entire time that got pushed under the rug or shoved underneath the rug.
Like Mark Driscoll literally said, get on the bus or the bus will run over you.
Yeah.
And that's what was happening.
Yeah. And again, the main point is just that like when there's a leadership fail, when leadership is poor, everybody hurts. That's why it's important. When leaders don't behave well, there's usually really negative ramifications that hurt a whole lot of people. So I don't know. What do you guys agree with that? What do you think about just the fact that when things blow up, it sort of illustrates how important it is that we need something better? Yeah.
I agree. I think whenever you have a big problem within an organization or a church, it maybe not always, but almost always says something about the leader. Even if they weren't the one doing the wrongdoing, back to that tone at the top, they're usually the one who's responsible for creating a system or a culture where wrongdoing was tolerated. And I agree, leadership is a big problem in the church right now. I would say particularly in the area of sexual harassment. Or perhaps I should say that there has been a problem for a long time, but it's only recently starting to come to light with some more frequency. I know you guys are probably familiar, about 5 years ago, the Me Too movement started, and that started bringing light to sexual harassment, like in all sectors of public life. And Hollywood, it's really rampant. There's the Harvey Weinstein trial, in workplaces, on college campuses. That was a big part of what I dealt with in my former role at UW system. And yes, even in churches. And as a matter of fact, there are so many stories of sexual harassment and abuse in churches that the phrase church too was coined. So you could go on like Twitter or Google right now and search for the hashtag church too, and you'll see countless stories of abuse in churches, and across all denominations. But a common theme of sexual harassment or abuse that was covered up. Victims were told to stay quiet or shamed, while abusers were elevated and promoted. And as a matter of fact, right now, the Federal Department of Justice is investigating the SBC, the Southern Baptist Convention, which is the largest Baptist group in America, for widespread sexual harassment and for the way they covered it up. And, that's a big deal, like for the feds to be investigating a group of churches.
Yeah, it's a huge deal. And that pattern you're naming where victims come forward and name the truth of what happened to them, and then it's covered up, and those who did, the oppressors were essentially protected. It sort of creates this dynamic where the person who is naming the truth is further punished. And so it's like, if I'm going to tell the truth of what happened, like the chances are I'm going to pay a price for even doing that. And, in Ephesians 5, it talks about having nothing to do with fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. And so I think part of this exposure that's happening is a good thing. I think if we're missing the mark, and it seems like we are on a broad level, then we need to bring that into the light so we can repent of it and turn towards something different, a different type of leadership.
Well, totally. And it ties into my earlier point about accountability, right? And culture. If sexual harassment is happening, it probably doesn't start with the worst possible incident you can think of. It usually starts with what we would say are just more like a culture where comments are tolerated or whatever. But if those things happen and you don't hold people accountable, you give it the green light to continue. And people see how leaders handle these situations and whether their primary concern is saving face or exposing it into submitting to wherever that leads.
Yep.
I'm pretty sure most churches don't start hoping to be in the news for something like this. So how do you think this happens? Like what factors contribute to this kind of widespread toxicity in church leadership?
One thing I would name is that it just seems like we're sort of attracting narcissists to lead our churches. And maybe part of how we got here is with the seeker-friendly, attractional model of church ministry. So just to review, the basic goal of the attractional model of church ministry is to attract as many people as possible, to your church. And on a broad level, this means having the best religious goods and services to offer people, the best kids programming, youth programming, small groups, and so on. But I think what's absolutely essential for the seeker model to work is to have a magnetic personality in the pulpit week after week, because that's what people want. They want to hear a gifted orator who they enjoy listening to. And so what happened is the profile of having a super charismatic lead pastor who's gifted in the pulpit became the primary thing, the primary job description and candidate profile churches were looking for when hiring lead pastors. So just think about this for a moment. If you create a job description where the primary focus is being a gifted communicator and wowing people with your words from a stage, and that person then gets to hold a microphone and speak for God week after week in a bright spotlight, and then get pats on the back from a crowd of people who are impressed with what they had to say, who do you think is going to want that job? Mm-hmm. But people who love the center of attention. So I think part of the problem is we've literally created a job description that attracts narcissists. And Chuck DeGroat wrote a book called When Narcissism Comes to the Church. And it's not just big churches, it's church planting. Like he's named that the primary profile that we have created to look for the gifting of a church planter is ultimately a narcissist. Mm. And so I think this is a big deal. I think we need to... It's really messing things up. Dan White Jr. said, an inflated ego with a weekly pulpit has done more damage than we can imagine. And then Diane Langberg, another leader in this conversation, said, never assume that someone who is gifted verbally and has theological knowledge is spiritually wise and mature.
That's a word.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and these people... are up on the stage or on Instagram Reels or whatever it might be, TikTok. I've never TikToked, but I think this happens on TikTok too.
I have never TikToked either.
And so they get traction, and it's natural, I think, to look for someone you admire and respect. But when lots of people are doing that and there's no accountability, it can be really destructive to someone's soul as they're in that position.
And notice the perfect codependency that exists. So this is what people want. They want to be entertained and hear, for instance, good preaching. Mm-hmm. That's what they want. That's what they want when they show up to churches. They want to hear good preaching.
But to be fair, I don't want to hear bad preaching.
Sure. But then they provide the very attention that the pastor is so desperate for. Right? So you have this perfect codependency where what they want is to be sort of entertained by good preaching, and the person preaching actually needs the attention, and so around and around it goes.
Sure. To take it back to the episode where we talked about discipleship, the church becomes more about an hour on Sunday where people are entertained than about tending to their own transformation all week long.
If people want to go deeper on this, there's several good resources that I think have come out in the last decade. So I've named Chuck DeGroat, When Narcissism Comes to the Church. Caitlin Beatty wrote a book called Celebrities for Jesus. A lot of what we were talking about with the abuse of power earlier. Mm-hmm. Diane Langberg, Redeeming Power. Wade Mullen, Something's Not Right. And then Scott McKnight wrote a book called A Church Called Tove. So maybe, Adam, can we put those in the show notes for people who might be interested?
Yeah, sure thing.
So, Cameron, you mentioned TikTok. What's interesting is I do think that widespread access to technology makes it somewhat easier to hold leaders accountable, right? Like we were talking about Church Too and Me Too, and you likely wouldn't have had those if you didn't have a platform like Twitter that everyone has access to get their stories out. A long time ago, you would have, pre-digital age, you would have had to go to a media outlet or get your story published in a book or something like that to bring it to light. And I look back to previous generations and I get the impression that there was more of an unquestioned deference to leaders in general. You certainly had some people who spoke up, but again, because there was less ability to or less access to with technology, it was just harder to speak out and to be heard. You talk to our parents or grandparents or people who held jobs maybe 50 years ago, and there's just kind of this mentality of, you're lucky to have a job, don't rock the boat, just put your head down and keep going. And I've spoken to many females multiple females, who experienced sexual harassment, sexual abuse, and couldn't say anything because they knew if they did, they wouldn't have been believed, and they wanted to keep their job. And so I think, obviously, respect for authority is a good thing, and there's something that we want to affirm there, but you can have respect for authority and accountability. And so I guess what I'm doing is naming the cultural shift towards accountability and the ways that technology has helped make that happen.
Yeah, the deference, what I hear you naming is that there's also a deference to people in positions of leadership. And sometimes that can be healthy, like a healthy respect for someone who is leading well maybe. But I also hear you naming something else, which feels even more significant, which is oftentimes the deference is because there's a power dynamic at play. And if I name what I'm experiencing, I risk the consequence of losing my job or some other
or being ostracized from the community. Right.
So the deference isn't actually rooted in respect. It's rooted in fear of how this could negatively impact me if I told the truth of what's happening. And I'll just tell you, it doesn't even have to always be something like sexual harassment. I do some coaching for the leader's journey, work with a whole variety of clients, some of whom are not in that top position of leadership. And this is one of the most common things I see is that they're noticing things that feel problematic or are violations of the organization's values or whatever it is. And they often don't name that and don't say it. And it's not out of just, I have such admiration for this leader. It's because of the risk that it would involve and fear of what could happen if they told the truth. And again, it's not necessarily like a big sexual problem. It's just like in the day-to-day exchange, I'm not able to be fully honest because there's a power differential here.
Totally.
And there's often, other examples that they can point to historically in the organization where the people who did that got fired or let go or whatever.
That's just it, right? These things are never isolated incidents. Like there's a culture. Day one, when you start at a job or you enter into a community, you start to pick up on the culture and whether or not the culture has integrity and wants to prioritize accountability and living into values, or whether it wants to prioritize maintaining an image.
Yeah, and that leads to the final maybe thing that I wanted to name in response to Cameron's question. Cameron, you asked, how did we get here? We've talked about the job description that we've created sort of attracts narcissists. We've talked about celebrity platforms and this deference to leadership. Another one is just the idol of success, where there are red flags attached to the leader or to the organization. And those red flags, those toxic behaviors, those dysfunctional relational patterns are sort of ignored because the church is growing or stuff is going well. And so there's this pragmatic mentality that the ends justify the means. And the ends don't always justify the means. How we get somewhere matters. Jesus brought about shalom, but he did so in a shalom kind of way, right? And what happens in many of these churches is that it's just this mentality, as long as the church is growing, as long as we're seeing, people raise their hands and pray to receive Jesus, as long as things appear to be going well, let's not draw attention to those red flags. We don't have to deal with those. Look at the success. Look at what God's doing. And so we sort of ignore it along the way. And ultimately, oftentimes this ends up catching up. The red flags become unignorable. And in examples like Mars Hill, for instance, you see the church had to close its doors. And maybe it's not that extreme, but it's like we're barely keeping our doors open.
Yeah. It's almost like the idea of publicly talking about or admitting that there is a problem could be seen as a hindrance to the church's image, which equals church growth.
Yes. And I'm telling you, talk to people on the other side of the aftermath, those on the inside of these churches, in positions of leadership, like elders who were supposed to, for instance, be holding the lead pastor or the staff accountable. And almost every time what I hear them say is, we noticed red flags. We saw, though, all the good stuff that was happening, so we sort of minimize those red flags. And if I have one regret, it was not attending to those red flags earlier.
Well, it tells you something about priorities. Right? Like maintaining the image of the church is more important than having a whole healthy community, even if it was to be smaller.
Yep.
Centered on faithfulness to God.
Before we hit record today, we were talking about how it's easy to point out problems and not cast vision for something better or healthier. So would you mind if we kind of switch gears? We've kind of named, hey, we seem to be having a lot of leadership problems in the evangelical church, of which we're a part. And we've named many of the problems, but let's switch gears and go, okay, so what? So what do we do about this?
We're not just trying to burn the house down.
Yeah. And I want to name that leadership structures matter, like how we structure leadership within the church really matters, but the best leadership structures still can't completely rescue you from a mess. Character problems can essentially ruin things no matter what the leadership structure is. Right? So I don't want to give the impression as we talk about these different leadership options that exist, the different structures, that if you just pick the right one, it's going to save you from ever experiencing a failure, because broken people can mess up any structure. But there's sort of two structures that I would say we want to avoid as a church. And the first one is the one we've been talking about, which is a hierarchical model. This is where the pastor is sort of the CEO, and it's everything sort of centered on that individual. The senior pastor is the guy. He's in charge. He gets to call all the shots and make all the big decisions. It's almost like the lead pastor. It's a monarchy. Mm-hmm. You're in charge. You're in control. You get to call the shots. And we don't have to go into all the problems with that, because just that's what we've been talking about over the last 20 minutes or so. Sometimes what happens, though, is that in reaction to all the hurt and pain of the senior pastor as CEO model, the pendulum swings and you end up with sort of a leadership-less model, a flat model. Dan White Jr. and J.R. Woodward in their book Church's Movement do a great job talking about that pendulum swing away from a hierarchical model towards a flat model where it's basically a leadership-less church where everyone is considered equal. And so if the first ditch we want to avoid is a monarchy, the second one is a democracy. And I just think you don't see in the New Testament Paul going around and planting churches and either putting a CEO in charge to run the congregation and or leaving them completely leadership-less. So we would propose a team model. This is the third structure. It's sometimes described in leadership circles as polycentric leadership, but it's one where authority is diffused among a group of mature Jesus followers who are submitted to one another and to the Holy Spirit. So leadership isn't given to just one person. It's given to a group of people who have the character and competency of Jesus and are working together underneath the leadership of the Holy Spirit. What would you guys add? Did I capture that well? How would you fill that in?
Yeah, I think so.
David Fitch said, if the first one is a monarchy and the second one is a democracy, maybe the example in the New Testament is what he calls a pneumocracy. Pneuma is the word for spirit. And so it's the idea that a group of people are submitted to each other underneath the leadership of the Holy Spirit.
Yeah. And I hear you saying there still is, there are still some positions that carry increased responsibility, but that responsibility is expressed maybe through a team, or where there is a senior most leader, they're also accountable to others around them.
Yes, that is what I'm saying.
Yeah. I think, I do think that model captures how we see the early church establishing leadership, as you mentioned. And I could also see how it does help protect us from some of the abuses that were happening today, right? Like having a leader not be the final say at the top of the food chain, but submitting to others around them. So how do we do that here, you guys? Here we are sitting as like three church leaders talking about the problems with leadership. What might we point to or name as examples in action here at Crosspoint?
Yeah, I think one thing is when it comes to preaching and who's up on the stage, so we try to get as many different people up there as we can. Because I think, one, it's better when we're all more represented. Not everyone is like me or like Mac or like Katie, or the list goes on and on. And I think it's healthy for people on the stage to not have the spotlight all the time.
Yeah, man, it's not good. I think it's not good for our congregation to get accustomed to only hearing from one person. So sharing the teaching among a group of people helps our congregation to learn to hear from God through many different voices and personalities. Mm-hmm. But it's also not good, I hear you naming, for the person who's in the spotlight every week. It's actually good for them to get out of the spotlight, share it with other people, and then receive the preaching of other people. Mm-hmm. This was a big shift for us. I mean, 5 years ago when we kind of went through a major transition as a church, this was one of the things that we almost immediately transitioned to, was sharing the pulpit across a group of people. And I know I got a lot of pushback for that. And it was hard to kind of hold the ground and go, no. I'm not going to preach every week. And here's why that's good for me and good for you. Mm-hmm. Like, I firmly believe that you, Katie, and you, Cameron, and the other people on our preaching team can say things in a way that I can't say them and bring insights that I don't have that our congregation desperately needs.
Yeah, it reminds me. So I've noticed something recently. And maybe it's unique to our community, but I don't think so. I've noticed that people often refer to churches as Pastor so-and-so's church. Oh, you go there. We love Pastor so-and-so. And it's usually just the one person who's preaching every week.
Yep.
And I just think that's really interesting and kind of reflects what you're saying. People associate the church with the lead pastor.
Yeah. Yeah, and you even hear it in the way, like, so I get made fun of a little bit sometimes for this, but we have visitors every week, so I often introduce myself when I begin preaching as one of the pastors on our team. And I do that intentionally because it's true. I'm not the pastor at Crosspoint. I'm just one of the pastors on our team. Cameron's one of the pastors on our team. Mm-hmm. And so it communicates. The language we use matters. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that, Cameron, you've done a great job sharing is just who is the voice, who gets to hold the microphone in front of the group of people. We want to share that responsibility broadly. Another one I would name, and this one probably isn't visible for our people, but just how the leadership team operates. So I'm part of our leadership team, and my goodness, this is a team leadership. On a leadership team is really important. When you have a senior pastor-centric model, what I've noticed is that elder teams, overseer teams, whatever language churches use, oftentimes they kind of take a passive role and just sort of rubber stamp the decisions that the lead pastor is making.
Yeah, and just to be clear, leadership team, you're talking about the board that oversees you.
Yes.
Some people might think you mean the three of us.
Yeah, no, yeah. When I say leadership team, I'm referring to kind of like our elder board. Mm-hmm. We just... for different reasons, I don't love that language. But the point is that in a team leadership model, I'm not bringing decisions that they passively rubber stamp. Rather, we're a team of equals who co-labor and work alongside one another to discern God's direction together as we submit to the Holy Spirit. So that's very different. It's very different than me showing up with an agenda that I'm trying to get them to approve of, rather than us discerning that agenda together as we all lean in and use our gifts as co-equals, co-laborers alongside one another. And I've seen that transformation among our leadership team from a group of sort of passive rubber stampers to a group of fully engaged, active participants.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you highlight the connection between engagement there as well. It helps, I think, give them a reason to feel engaged as opposed to, well, I don't really need to know about this. I'm just going to be asked to rubber stamp it. But when you're actually asked to weigh in and pray about something and help make the decision, I think it does help people be more engaged because they're more empowered and there's more responsibility there. So I see that.
Let me name one other thing here. And it's similar to what I named about our congregation needs your voice, Cameron. They need your voice, Katie. They need to hear from people other than me. It's the same thing with our leadership team. It's not just like, oh, we're going to do team leadership because that's what we need their insights. We need every leadership team member. We need their contributions because they have insight that the three of us don't have. They have access to things we don't have access to. We live in this world. They're connected to our congregation in some ways on a deeper level. Mm-hmm. So it is about activating people's gifts and sharing authority and responsibility, but it's also the sense of like, we actually need each other to make wise decisions and to lead our congregation well.
Yeah, and I see this same thing on our staff team. We have a very collaborative staff team environment. Every Monday we get together for 2 hours and kind of go over everything for the week and check in with each other. And I would say there's a high degree of permission to share in that space, even on issues that may not be like my primary area of responsibility. I still feel that I have a permission to share my opinion in a respectful and in a way that I'm sort of submitting it to the group. I'm not stepping in and dominating and saying, well, this is how I think it should be, and I'm going to be really offended if it doesn't go that way. But I do feel I have permission to speak into really every issue that's brought before the group. We had a staff retreat, you guys remember from last year, where we spent a lot of time looking at different conflict styles, kind of tied to Enneagram numbers. And it was really interesting. If you look at our whole team, there were kind of 3 different conflict styles, and each one was about a third represented. Like a third of the people were more sort of assertive and very comfortable leaning into conflict. About a third were more withdrawn and not as comfortable leading into the conflict. And then a third were kind of in that middle space. And we just worked through that.
Which one were you, Katie?
I was in the assertive.
Yeah. Was that a surprise to you?
Yes. It was. I remember saying, but I'm not assertive. And then everyone just looked at me.
Yes.
That's also because I thought I was a 9 until that retreat.
Yes.
I've seen how I could be interpreted as being assertive.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Since then. I'll give it to you.
Still won't own it, but.
Yeah, I still don't completely own it. No, I hope I am in a healthy way. But, I just thought it was really cool how we talked about how, given all those different personalities and different approaches to conflict, we can create a healthy team environment where we can all collaborate and share openly and make sure that those who maybe are more comfortable leading into conflict don't dominate the space, but also making sure that those who are more withdrawn have some responsibility to speak up as well, and creating an environment that makes it safe and welcoming to do that.
Yeah, and you're highlighting one of the requirements for this type of collaborative environment where leadership and responsibility is shared, which is just having a lot of emotional maturity. Mm-hmm. I think in order for this to go well, you need tons of emotional maturity among those who are involved, and a lot hangs on having mature and healthy relationship in order to engage this work, because it's going to get messy. I mean, when 2 people or a group of people come together and are sharing what they really think and believe or what should happen, conflict is going to happen. It just is. And people are going to get anxious and reactive and say and do things because they're anxious. Mm-hmm. And learning how to engage that in healthy ways and learning how to listen, talk so other people can listen so other people can talk, hold tension in a productive way. I just want to share that, like, that's probably been some of the most day-to-day work for all of us, mm-hmm. is as we pursue this team model of leadership, it's required us to go all in and growing our own emotional maturity and then talking about those moments openly and honestly and with love and care when we don't do so well. Mm-hmm. We've even had to do that, the 3 of us. Just have feedback loops. Hey, what was that about? Let's talk about it. And those actually become growth opportunities for each one of us, with the byproduct being a deeper relationship on the other side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just think it's worth naming. It takes some real intentionality to do that. Like, it's more expedient just to gloss over things or to make a quick decision and move on.
Let's have a vulnerable moment, because I don't know what Adam will say here, but we have Adam sitting here. He's our producer, and we're naming that we've tried to create a really collaborative staff environment rooted in emotional maturity and health. Adam, does that fit your experience?
Yeah, I'd say so. Yeah, I'm definitely not assertive. That's complete opposite. I'm definitely withdrawn, and it takes work for me to, assert myself or speak up in any way, but I've never experienced staff culture here to force me to be withdrawn in any way. I've always felt an openness or a welcoming tone to speak up or voice my opinion or thoughts.
I recall a staff meeting where you got real heated on something and had a little bit of an outburst.
Yeah.
And we were all like, yes, where has that been?
That was one of my favorite Adam moments, but it wasn't your favorite.
Those things are my least favorite.
Yeah, you didn't
I
have
don't like
fun.
experiencing myself like that.
Yeah.
So again, that just goes back to my own work and like needing to speak up more often so that I don't bottle things up and then just explode. So
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to just normalize the fact that we're never going to arrive here. When you're operating in a team leadership model where you're tackling important things together, it's going to get messy. You don't arrive at a place of perfect maturity. It's something you have to continually attend to, as you go. Cameron, what would you say are like maybe a downside or downsides of team leadership?
I mean, I think it slows things down. It's easier and faster just for one person to make a decision. And it requires giving up control of how a decision goes, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I remember.
Oh, go ahead.
This was earlier on when I was more a volunteer position than paid staff. But I can't remember what the decision actually was to be made, but I was somehow like waiting for a decision to be made. It just felt like it was taking forever. And you guys know Lord of the Rings. There's the scene with the hobbits who are with the Ents, the talking trees, waiting to decide or make a decision on whether or not they should engage in the war.
Oh, yes.
And the tree comes back, the lead tree guy, and he says, "We have decided that you guys are not orcs."
Yes.
Yes, that's a great example. Sometimes it can feel that way. And it does slow things down. When you have more people involved, there's more to talk through and more to discern. And I think that is a significant downside. Don't be an ant.
Yes. So I think there's some implications. This isn't just for us sitting around the table or on staff or part of the leadership team, but we want this to be a value that kind of infuses every part of our church. Our hope is that all of you listening who are part of our church community would lean into this team leadership thing as well. And there's some implications for that. Like the church won't be built around one person.
Yeah, I mean, I often tell our leadership team as a reminder, hey, if I get hit by a beer truck tomorrow and die.
Only in Wisconsin.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm going to go, that's probably how it's going to happen in Wisconsin. Like the decisions we make here, you have to own. Mm-hmm. See, like if it's just centered on me or another lead pastor and something happens to that lead pastor and you've been passively rubber stamping all of their decisions, then what happens when they're gone? You're sitting with someone else's decisions. Mm-hmm. But if we're making these decisions together and something happens to me, well, hopefully you'll miss me a little bit, but this.
We have a life insurance policy on you.
This continues. Like this continues because it was a we the entire time. So
yeah, for sure. I think there's also an invitation that if you are serving or anywhere in our church, really, that we hope that you would lean in and participate deeply, which we've talked a lot about in participation. But one of the ways I see this playing out is I see people on like volunteer teams who have lots of opinions and thoughts and good ideas that just kind of sit back and wait for someone to ask them what they think. And part of this value is like, no, like we're all helping to lead the ministries here at this church together. So like lean in and share. And, even if it is difficult or uncomfortable and yeah.
That's so good. We've been talking a lot about how things are structured sort of at the top amongst the leadership team, the staff, et cetera. But like everybody on our staff team is also committed to a team model of leadership. So they don't go into, let's say, children's ministry and Sarah's like, the narcissist who's got everything at her finger, controlling everything and making it all about her. She wants a team of people who are sharing the responsibility of ministry with and alongside her as co-laborers, right? Mm-hmm. So and Josiah is our worship pastor, so he's doing the same thing with the worship team. And so we create a culture where there's deep participation across the community. All right, well, listen, I think here's the big takeaway for today. It's that leadership really matters. It's necessary for the church to multiply disciples who live on mission in the world. We need leaders who help us pursue that mission and vision. And one of the evidences of just how much leadership matters is when there's hurt, the hurt that results when leaders fail. And we've seen a lot of failures over the last several years, predominantly because we're elevating competency over character. But I think what we need is a group of competent people who also have the character of Jesus, who are sharing leadership authority underneath the leadership of the Holy Spirit, and in a way that's marked by mutual submission and self-sacrificial love toward one another and the community they're serving. I think maybe one next step for our listeners as we wrap up today is just to evaluate what leadership or influence they have in life and maybe audit how they're stewarding that power and authority. I think we're all leaders in some places in our life, whether that's at home or work or whatever. Am I leading with character and competency in the way of Jesus, or am I living in a different way that likely could cause hurt and pain for myself and those around me?
Yeah, so thanks for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Next, we're going to discuss a final core value here at Crosspoint, and I'm excited for this one, reconciliation. We believe that God's mission is about the restoration of all things through the person of Jesus Christ, and we are invited to participate in this reconciling work, which will involve living as everyday peacemakers together and in our world. So we hope you'll tune in, and we'll see you next time.
Praxis is recorded and produced at Crosspoint Community Church. Find out more about the show and our church at crosspointwi.com. If you have any questions, comments, or any suggestions for future topics, feel free to send us an email. Also, if you enjoy the show, consider leaving a review. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.